Hello, my name is David Brennan, and my question is, I've heard a lot of people talk about the Bible condoning slavery. My question to you is, does the Bible condone slavery? And if so, what are the ramifications for today's society? And I guess, how would we respond to someone who makes that accusation about the Bible?
That is really a good question. First of all, depending on how deep you want to get into that, David, and David and what? Who do I always remember? What's your wonderful girlfriend's? Mackenzie, yes. See, I always either remember one or the other. But if you really want to get into this, a guy named J. Oliver Buswell, I think that's how you spell it, wrote the classic book that's called Slavery, Segregation, and God. And by the way, he was not a proponent of those. It's just an excellent, this would be the Ravi Zacharias level. If you know him, he's a Christian apologist. But I'll just give a little easier one. First of all, slavery is not something that the Bible condones, rather it regulates, because it's, even today, even though no one talks about it, there are actually hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that are enslaved right now. If you know anything about the Muslim world, there is a lot of slavery. You all know that Islamic State is selling slaves. But I'm talking about not the Islamic State, I'm talking about the Muslim world, that the indentured servitude, I guess you'd call it, that Filipinos, for example, go through to be shipped from the Philippines to work in the Emirates or wherever they work in Saudi, is tantamount to slavery, and that's the positive slavery. You get the negative slavery. There's, of course, sexual slavery. There's the whole North Korea, the whole country is enslaved, basically, except for the ruling party. But what the Bible did is, in a culture of slavery, the world always has had slavery. Slavery is, number one, prisoners of war. If you have a prisoner of war, you often enslave them. The children of Israel were taken off and had to work for the Assyrians. And of course, Egyptians enslaved the Jews. The Jews, when they conquered Canaan, they caused, if you remember, the Gibeonites in Joshua. The Gibeonites were the only Canaanites that were not outright in the first wave exterminated. God said, exterminate the Canaanites because their iniquity is full. And, they actually said the Amorites. But the Gibeonites, if you remember, tricked Joshua and had the worn-out shoes and the moldy bread and the worn-out bags that they were carrying, and tricked him, and so he didn't kill him, because he made a covenant with them, but they became hewers of wood and carriers of water, so they became slaves. So basically, in the biblical times, it was culturally the norm that people conquered in war were either killed or enslaved, and enslavement was better than killing. And if you remember David, when he conquered Ammon of Rabbah, modern-day Jordan, it says he set the people down, they all laid on the ground, and he took a measuring tape and he measured out 1, 2, and they killed all those, and he kept the third measure. And that's how they did it. And that was just because life was rugged back then. Kind of what we're seeing in the news is what the world was like. But I don't want to get off. ISIS is not as brutal as the Assyrians. The Assyrians were far more brutal than ISIS has quite gotten to yet. So that was the first thing. The second thing was indebted people. And you could be enslaved for a period of time and that's, I mean, we have that indentured servitude in America, not of African black people that were captured by the slave ships. We're talking about people that came from the continent in the colonial times as indentured servants to work in a sawmill or something and work off their passage. And so there was a lot of that. So in the biblical time, there were basically two main groups of people: the prisoners of war and the indebted people. By the time we get to that's the Old Testament. By the time we get to the New Testament period of time, the Roman Empire, by various measurements, could have had a population is into the tens of millions. I mean, I've read everything up to 60 million slaves, but that's a little bit high. But let's say that there were 20 plus million slaves in the Roman Empire. And these were people primarily that were captives, because the Roman Empire, went all the way to, Central Europe and Northern Africa and all the way to the Indus Valley, where the Parthians were. And so as the Roman Empire conquered people, they enslaved them. So there were basically free men, slaves, the military, and the nobility. And those were the strata of society. So what the scriptures did is, God did not, and that's what's interesting, what's changed. God did not ask the church to overthrow the political order. Jesus never went along with the Herodians, zealots, break the oppression. That is a modern thing of Christendom, getting involved in political activism. It wasn't biblical, because what God said is that you don't want to upset the culture and impose biblical or godly standards on an unregenerated culture. And again, I don't want to get off target here, but guys like Zwingli, Ulrich Zwingli, if you've ever heard of him, and of course all of you have heard of John Calvin, they both were political activists to the exponentially. Ulrich Zwingli was a sword-carrying fighter. He was a reformer, but he intermingled, societal change with carrying a sword and fighting. And Calvin, he burned people at the stake that didn't follow the rules of Geneva. He was a Christian. And if people didn't obey the rules, they burned them. Wow. And so this is an interesting one to get in. So I guess let me go back to the question just to answer. Does God, the Bible, but God wrote the Bible, does the Bible condone slavery? In the sense of taking people against their will, enslaving them, and forcing them to labor for whatever reason, the Bible never condones that, but it regulates it. And the Bible says, if you're going to have a slave, it doesn't say it's right or wrong. If you're going to have one, you must, in fact, let me just show you. Let's see. Let's go to, let me see. How about Exodus? Where's the all through the ear one? Exodus, is it 18? 18. No. It's the one where if you want to serve, where is it? If someone finds it. It says if you have a slave and he works off his... 21. There, thank you. I knew someone. You guys with the quick computers. I was off 3. Here we go. Thank you. Exodus 21. So everybody look at Exodus 21. So does the Bible condone slavery? No. Okay, so there's David, there's the short one. You want me to keep going? The Bible doesn't condone the institution of slavery. It regulates it. Now, God introduces the institution of marriage. God invented the family. Slavery is like a lot of other things. It's just part of fallenness. and it's part of greed and materialism and pride and everything else. But what the Bible does is it offers humane regulations if you're in an area where slavery is practiced. God says you should be very careful. I'm watching you. And I'll show you in the Old Testament, I'll show you in the New. Okay, chapter 21. These are the judgments which you shall set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant. Now wait a minute, let's pause for a second. Did you know in the truest sense, my father grew up in what could easily be a slave family? His grandfather worked for a company his whole life. The company provided housing. The company provided food. They lived in company, houses. They shopped at the company store. They worked in the company mine. And basically, when they got all done with that, they didn't make any money. They just existed. And my grandfather worked that way in Colorado, New Mexico mines. And my grandfather continued working there. He worked in the store. And it was interesting. He worked for much of his life in the company store. He earned enough money to stay upstairs over the company store with his bride and raise a family, but they never had quite enough money after they paid for their housing and their food at the company store and did all their work to get anything out of it. They weren't called slaves, and there was no one binding them there, but there was a system that totally kept them. And if you think about that, Japan. When I went to Japan in the 80s, most people there worked for the same company their whole life. You could not quit your job. You could not move from job to job. They didn't have this American, whatever you want to do. You just worked at the company your whole life. And the company paid you enough that you could have a house and that you could eat, but you worked for the company. The company told you what to do, told you when you could come, when you couldn't come, how much time you'd have off. They paid for the medical. Basically, that's what slavery was like. Now, I know what American slavery got to and British slavery and the sugar plantations. And we've had so many movies about that. I feel like I lived through it. That's not how it was in the biblical times. In the biblical times, there were actually 8 different types of slaves. Now, tell me, is this slavery? You had a therapon slave. A therapon was someone that consulted with the master and guided his decisions. I would call that an investment advisor. They lived in the master's house. They ate at his table. They listened to everything he did and they guided him. That was a slave. Sounds pretty good to me. I wouldn't mind doing that, to live in some palatial Roman manor and eat whatever, and just sit at the meal and listen. That was a therapon. Then there were the ones, we have these here at our church. Diaconia. In fact, I remember my first Sunday, I was scared to death the deacons. They were wearing, they have those badges, say deacon, Dan Haney probably has one on tonight as the chairman. And I went up and I said, do you know what that Greek word means? And I was the brand new pastor. It was 8 years ago, and they didn't know what to think of me. And they said, no, what does it mean? I said, it means slave. They said, yes, sir. I said, yeah, you are and this was actually a waiter, a ministering slave. In the New Testament church, there were these type of slaves. They were the ones that poured the water and carried the food to the table. There were also oiketes. I could just list off each of these. My favorite one, of course, the one I talked about this morning, there were doulas. A doulas was the bond slave. Now, this would be more like American slavery and British slavery and probably Barbary, pirate, Muslim world slavery. Bond slave, and ISIS and everything else. A bond slave was purchased at the slave market like you'd buy a toaster. You'd go up and say, I want a 4-slice, thick for, bagels, and I want it shiny. And so you'd look over they'd line them all up and turn around and pinch them and say, I'll buy that one. And they were marked and stamped, and they got a slip, and they bought them, and they were totally a possession of the master. And the master, these doulos, these bond slaves, Roman masters in the Roman world in the New Testament used to throw, for entertaining the guests, used to throw their slaves into swimming pools that were in the center of the banquet hall, where they had carnivorous creatures like conger eels and moray eels and piranhas, and they would be eaten alive for the guests to watch, because a slave was like a toaster. It was a person that was not a person. And so, it's interesting, and we could go through all those. My favorite one would be actually it was the lowest of all the slaves. The Greek word in the New Testament is huperetes. Huper is a preposition, means under, and retes, this part of the word, means to row. This is a galley slave, an under rower. And this was, if this was like a toaster, this was like a disposable AA battery. These guys were the galley slaves. Ben-Hur, kind of, in the galley slaves. And they were chained in triremes. A trireme was one of those 3-deck Roman big long boats, and they had paddles coming out, 3 levels high, and they had benches with these men holding telephone pole-sized paddles. When you look at telephone poles, think of telephone poles sticking out of the sides of these triremes, these 3-deck Roman galley slave ships, and they would have multiple men, 3 or 4 of them, that would be pushing and pulling those, and those men were chained to the floor of the boat, and they were chained on their wrists, and they were chained to their seat. And they rowed until they couldn't row anymore, and they unchained him and threw him like a disposable battery into the water. And, they were fish food. And what's interesting about that is that 2 people in the Bible identify themselves for God as a huperetes. David and Paul. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4:1, if a man account of me, let him account for me as a servant. And he uses that word, huperetes. And in Acts 13, God says that David was my servant. And he uses that word too. So it's interesting that the 2 most profoundly influential people in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, both, interestingly enough, call themselves the very lowest slave that was known in the ancient world, only they were an under rower for God, and they did what he told them to do. So for us, back to your original question, if I can back up to it here, David, the Bible regulates slavery in chapter 21. Look at how of Exodus it says, if you buy a servant, he shall serve 6 years. This is an indentured kind of servant. This is someone in debt. This is someone that, for whatever reason, needs money. He obligates himself kind of like a sharecropper or whatever you want to call it. He needs somewhere to work. He's probably out of work, and he says, I'll work for you for 6 years. In the 7th, you shall go free. Now, let me ask you, what's going on in North Dakota during the fracking thing? That's what people were doing. They were going up there, and they were saying, I will work these terrible hours, and I'll get oil all over me, and whatever, I'm in debt, I want to buy a pickup truck or whatever I want. And he comes in by himself, he goes out by himself. He comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him, and on and on. But look at this. Look at verse 5. This is what's so beautiful of Exodus 21. But if the servant plainly say, I love my master, my wife, my children, and I will not go out free. I love my master? This is not the kind of slavery we're talking about. This is someone that says, I can't imagine living outside of this household. I mean, I feel like this is my family. This is my life. I want to be here. So I love my master. And I don't want to go out of this verse 5, free. His master shall bring him to the judges, and he shall also bring him to the door of the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. In other words, he had this public, permanent, painful marking, his ear pierced, and showing that he wanted a mark that he was not a slave that was just paying off 6 years' debt, that he wanted to live with that master forever. This is an example that God regulates slavery. And there's so much more. I mean, if you hit your slave and it harmed him, he went free. And if you hit him and killed him, then you were punished. And there were all kinds. I mean, slaves were people with rights in the Bible. And what God said is, instead of overturning society by outlawing slavery, which would have, all it would have done, if Paul would have said slavery is outlawed, the Roman Empire would have just erased all the Christians, would have killed them all, because the Roman Empire couldn't run without slaves, tens of millions of them. But what Paul did say, and if you go to the New Testament, look at Colossians 4. I want to show you an example of how, and there are many of these, but, and I think it's Colossians 4. You guys, why do you always, well, let's go to Ephesians. An easier one is Ephesians 6:5. And there's also one in Titus, and there's one in Colossians. But here's one in the Spirit-filled life. Ephesians chapter 5, it starts in verse 21, submit to one another, 5:21. And then he talks about wives in 22 of chapter 5. Then he talks about husbands in 25. And then he talks about children in chapter 6, verse 1. But now look at chapter 6, verse 5. Ephesians 6:5. Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your master according to the flesh. That's this level. Remember the toaster level right here. The word is doulos, the bondservants, the bondslaves. If you're one of those, if you were bought at a slave market, by the way, you know what's so interesting about this? It was so prevalent, slavery was. Every town had a slave market. Every town. Not just, Charleston and Boston. Every town in the Roman Empire had a slave market. Every town had a place where slaves were auctioned. Everybody knew slavery. Everybody understood the language. And so what the Lord says is, if you are one of those, verse 5, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh with fear and trembling in sincerity of heart as to Christ. Not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service, as to the Lord, not to men. Do you know what that's saying? Now you want to get, we all know the evils of slavery. But God said that a bond slave was supposed to serve his master like Christ. The master, like he was serving Christ. He was not to do a Spartacus insurrection rebellion and try and kill his master, try and overthrow the social order. He was supposed to stay where he was. And, that's what it says. Do you know why the New Testament world was overturned and why the Roman Empire became Christian? If God would have said, Paul, spend all your time in political activism, get all those slaves freed, and get them, we're going to change society from the outside in, never would have happened. You get bond slaves. In the early church, more of the people in the church were slaves than were free. The early church just went like wildfire through the slavery because they had nothing to live for. They didn't know when the master was going to throw them into the conger eel pool and have them eaten alive. They had no hope. They had no identity. They were just toasters. And the Lord says, instead of trying to trick your masters, steal from your masters, don't work when he's not looking, be a men pleaser, be hateful. Don't do any of that stuff. Serve in sincerity of heart, verse 5 of Ephesians 6. As you're doing the will of God from your heart, do it for me, for the Lord. And what happened is that these slaves became, because slaves were everywhere, slaves were like light bulbs. They were just everywhere. And all of a sudden, the Roman Empire started being swept with these formerly hopeless, embittered, you had to threaten them and beat them and kill them, throw them to the eels. People, all of a sudden, the slaves became vibrant, radiant, uncomplaining, not striking for more money. I think about that. My father personally had a conviction he would not go with all the UAW stuff and do everything he could against the company. In fact, I used to work for UPS. I was a Teamster. And as soon as I found out what Teamsters had to do, I quit UPS. I was making $20, $30 an hour back then when I was in school. But I wouldn't do what the Teamsters do, because the Teamsters, and I don't know if they still do it, I just know in the 80s when I was a Teamster, they would do things to destroy and disrupt the business until they got the pay they wanted, or the union said, or whatever it was. Bond slaves were told, don't do that. Serve whoever you work for with such sincerity of heart and so hard and with no complaining. You can read it. Titus, as long as we're into this, boy, I didn't know you were going to get us in this far, but look at Titus 2. This whole idea of America has redefined biblical labor. And we think that it's noble and right to protest and strike and extort every dime we can get out. And I know that the employers are greedy and don't give proper salary and care. But look what it says. Let's see, bondservants. It's Titus 2:9. Exhort bondservants. There they are again. This is the lowest level, the toaster slaves, the light bulb slaves, the ones that were omnipresent, the purchase ones at every slave market in every city. Exhort the bondservants to be obedient to their own masters, to be well-pleasing in all things, not answering back. No back talk, no, just giving them what they deserve. Not pilfering, verse 10. Not taking things that weren't yours, but showing all good fidelity. Now look at this. What Christianity did is, God says, wherever you are, you're a slave. Verse 10, adorn the doctrine of God in all things. Be as a slave, a reflection of Christ. Do you know what's amazing? If Christians had more of what John the Baptist told laboring people, if you have this excessive demand of the government and they take your coat, give them your what? Yeah, John the Baptist said, if they compel you to go this far, don't protest your wages to the Roman soldiers. And then Jesus said, if they sue you, give them what they want. This was not at all like what our culture is like. Our culture is into getting everything for me, and it ruins our Christian testimony. And so bond slaves, God never condoned slavery. And in fact, God is totally the one who said that there aren't even races. There's only one human race, and there are no people that should be enslaved because they're inferior. But because of the hardness of human heart, it's kind of like divorce. God didn't invent divorce, he regulated it. Divorce is because of the hardness of the human heart. God's plan is lifetime, an unbreakable covenant. But because of the hardness of your heart, Deuteronomy 24, God said, here's regulations. So because God regulated divorce, does he approve of it? No. But does he say there's no such thing as divorce and kind of be like Bill Gothard was and say that there is no way that divorce could ever occur? No, God is not unreasonable. Unregenerate people cannot follow that higher standard. So God regulated the necessary societal evils. One of our problems is most Christians nowadays are spending their life strength, these political activists trying to reform society, and you can never reform society. Never. You can only reform hearts, not society. Because who's the God of this world that really is controlling society? Satan. And we're going to get into that with spiritual warfare, because the real way to change America is not to elect the most Christian candidate out there, because I'll tell you what, they won't do very well probably. It's to pray for the transformation of individuals. And if all of our political activist people spent as much time as they do going door to door and canvassing and raising money and posting everything that Walmart does wrong, if they spent as much time winning people to Christ, there would be such a change in society. But we like to do the activism stuff because it's something we can really do. Soul winning is hard. Nurturing people, discipling people, doing what Paul did is hard. It wore him out and he died for it. It's easier to do the other stuff, to kind of militate and everything else. So I'm sorry. Boy, you shouldn't have asked that, David. I've been up since 4 o'clock this morning, so I talk more tired I get. But does the Bible condone slavery? No.